Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here with the devlog for Devember Day 18. Apologies up front. I have a bit of a tickly throat, may cough throughout this thing. I'm going to do my best to not do that, however, and try to keep this fairly short. I managed to get some development work a little bit done on Devember before the stream actually started, with the general goal towards coming up with a scheme in the server for being able to dispatch messages in the client. So that we can start with our actual conversation. To that end, we did a little bit of code cleanup in the client, changing the case of method names to be more C-sharpy, if you will, because we try to keep the code standards as best we can with the platform that we're using. And then we extended the I protocol message interface to include the message ID, which is something that the Python code version of the code does. Server hasn't done it up to now. I can't remember if there was a specific reason for that or not, but we do need that for actual dispatching. So we just add that in as a read-only property. The classes instances set it and forget it, if you will. That allows the code that has an object instance to figure out what type it actually is. And with that, the build client has a new dispatch method that takes one of those arguments, and based on the type ID, it calls a method inside itself. So now there is a handle error, handle introduction, handle message, right? Simplistically enough, each one of those takes a parameter of the appropriate message type, and the dispatcher typecasts it because it knows what the type is going to be. So everything is nice. And with that in place, everything still works the way it does because we haven't hooked the dispatcher up yet, right? So we flip on over to the receive code, which used to respond to receiving a message by immediately sending it again. Instead of doing that, it calls dispatch on the method, and then each one of those three dispatch handlers has to send the message in order to continue the echo. And tested that, that worked out. That's pretty much what I had going into the stream tonight. With that in mind, we started in on the actual conversational mechanics between our client and our server. And the first thing I wanted to do was introduce the ability for the server to transmit a message to the remote end and then close the connection once it was done. Particularly for, say, an error message, we transmit an error back to the client to say, "What you talking about, Willis?" And then once that transmission is done, we gracefully shut down the socket and close it. We don't want to continue communications on a channel where an error has occurred, and we don't want to leave that up to the client. So we just close that connection ourselves, and this sent us off into a long spiral of what the hell's happening, because we were getting exceptions in the send code, and I spent a bunch of time trying to figure out why that was the case. And as is generally what happens when you're working with a thread type environment, we added an exception handler around the receive code, and then the exceptions in the send code went away because, yeah, that's what we want. And we also fiddled around with various hacky ways to try to mask those particular errors. Now, I don't know if I've done this correctly. The only thing I really have to go on is the example code from the .NET framework documentation, which had absolutely no error checking whatsoever. That code can successfully, in response to a send, close. So I don't know why I'm having a problem there. But nevertheless, similarly, I don't know what the appropriate design pattern for C# code is for message dispatching, so I'm just sort of throwing my own knowledge at it to try and at least get something working, and that's something that can be fixed later. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, we now move into what we actually wanted to do in the stream, which was get our communications channel up and running in the appropriate way. So with that in mind, modify the dispatcher accordingly so that the dispatcher for the introduction message does various tests. First of all, the client needs to know if it has been introduced to anybody or not. And by client, I mean the build client in the server. We're talking all server code here right now. Okay. The only message that should be allowed at the beginning once a connection is made is an introduction message. So the other end, the client, the Python client, can introduce itself to us and we know who they are. And we need to either vet their response and accept them, or we need to give them an error and close the connection. So for right now, the connection tests that we're doing is if we've already received an introduction message, throw an error. There can only ever be one of those. It's the first message. That's the only time the introduction message appears. If the introduction message does not have a protocol version that matches ours, then that is an error because for right now, just for test purposes, we only want the protocol version we expect, and anything else uh, get mad about. That's just, a proof of concept thing, if you will. Failing that, set the flag saying we were introduced and send a message back that introduces and passes the username of the user that was in the introduction message back in that message, just so that that all makes sense, if you will. We spin on down to the dispatching method and add code that says that if this client is not yet introduced to anyone, then immediately send back an error and close the connection if this message isn't an introduction message. That is to make sure that because the introduction message is supposed to be the very first message that we get, that before anything else can happen, if any other message happens before the introduction, don't even dispatch it to the appropriate handler. Just send an error immediately. That makes the rest of the handling a lot easier. I can't remember if I mentioned it, but the introduction message handler also throws an error if you send it an introduction message and it's already been introduced. In that case, it gets mad because, hey, only one of those. And then we modified our client code to test those theories. We tried to send a message without an introduction. We tried to send an introduction twice. And we tried to send an introduction message with a different version number and just verified that all of those errors trigger. Now, a part of that, realize that the fields in the introduction message are fixed length and padded with null bytes, and the server wasn't properly trimming null bytes off the right-hand side, so it would send them back to the client in a part of a message, and the client would accept that because that's a fixed length string. It shouldn't. It thinks it's not a fixed length string. It's a variable length string. It thinks it doesn't need to trim it. So we had to do a little bit of a bug fix in the server for that as well. And this is the stuff we have going. So we are aces to continue with our code, which I think is going to involve, excuse me, more of the same. We're going to need to start delving into configuration on the server to configure it, telling it where its cache directories are. The introduction message handling is going to need to do more to actually pretend that it's checking usernames and passwords, but really it's just setting up the appropriate cache directory entries, caching what build information we know about inside that cache folder. That's the stuff that's coming up, moving ever closer, inching along the path to actually being able to transmit messages back and forth. And we're just going to keep patching in messages as we need them and getting things working there. And then we'll worry about cleaning everything up once we have something that works, as is our want. And that is the end of this dev stream, which has also gone a little bit long. It's just one of those nights. Only 2 coughs. That's not too shabby. I hope you enjoy the dev streams and the devlogs. Thank you for liking videos and subscribing to the channels. And stay sublime.